Whoa. 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 Whoa.
נודר כמה ומתקפה על איום מתקפה פיני עמוס
אימא'לה
זה יורד, כושה לדודה שלהם, זה יורד לידי. תראו את השני, הנה הוא מתפצל. אחד יורד פוגע, יואו הרדי, הוא נופל בראשון. יואו, תראו.
The missiles landed less than 10 miles from the most dangerous building in the Middle East. Not a military base, not an air defense battery, a nuclear reactor, a facility that Israel has never officially admitted exists, that holds enough fissile material to make the region uninhabitable for generations. And that just came closer to being struck by Iranian ballistic missiles than at any point in the history of the Israeli-Iranian conflict. If those missiles had hit their mark, if the trajectory had been slightly different, if the intercept had failed at the wrong moment, we would not be talking about a military escalation. We would be talking about the beginning of a nuclear catastrophe in the most volatile region on Earth. This is not a hypothetical. This is what just almost happened. And the fact that the mainstream news cycle has already moved on from it should alarm every single person watching this video. Welcome to Conflict Capital. Stay with us, because this story is far bigger than anyone is telling you, and you need to understand exactly what was at stake. If you are new to this channel, Conflict Capital is where we break down the weapons, the wars, and the power moves that shape the world, without the spin and without the filter. Hit that subscribe button right now and tap the like button. It genuinely helps us keep making content at this depth, and what we are covering today is exactly why this channel exists. Let us get into it. Let us start with the place itself, because most people watching this have heard the name Dimona without fully understanding what it is. Dimona is a small city in the Negev desert in southern Israel. Population around 35,000 people, unremarkable in almost every way except for one thing. Approximately 13 kilometers outside the city, in the middle of the desert, sits a facility officially known as the Negev Nuclear Research Center. Israel calls it a research facility. The rest of the world calls it what it almost certainly is, the heart of Israel's nuclear weapons program. The Dimona reactor, as it is universally known, has been operating since the early 1960s. It was built with French assistance during a period when France and Israel had a close strategic relationship, and it was deliberately designed and located to be as inconspicuous as possible. For years, the Israeli government deflected international questions about it with a policy of deliberate ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying that Israel possessed nuclear weapons, a policy that remains official Israeli doctrine to this day. Israel has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It has never allowed International Atomic Energy Agency inspections of the Dimona facility, and it has never confirmed what every serious intelligence agency on Earth has concluded for decades, that Israel possesses somewhere between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads, making it the only nuclear-armed state in the Middle East. The Dimona facility is not just a reactor. Based on everything that is publicly known, from the 1986 revelations of Israeli nuclear technician Mordechai Vanunu, who was subsequently kidnapped by Mossad and imprisoned for 18 years, to decades of satellite imagery analysis and independent research. The Negev Nuclear Research Center is a comprehensive nuclear weapons complex. It almost certainly includes plutonium reprocessing facilities, weapons assembly areas, and storage for both nuclear materials and finished warheads. The reactor itself has been operating for over 60 years, which means it has accumulated a significant inventory of spent fuel and nuclear byproducts, in addition to its weapons-grade material production. A direct hit on this facility would not just be a military strike. Depending on what was hit, what burned, and what released into the atmosphere, it could be an environmental and humanitarian catastrophe affecting not just Israel, but Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and potentially beyond, all depending on wind patterns and the nature of the damage. This is the context in which Iranian missiles struck the area around Dimona. And this is why every single detail of what happened matters enormously. Iran's April attack on Israel, part of the ongoing cycle of strikes and counterstrikes that has marked the most dangerous period in the Israeli-Iranian conflict in decades, included ballistic missiles targeted at military sites in the Negev region. Israeli and American air defense systems intercepted the vast majority of projectiles, but some missiles and debris came down in the Negev, and the proximity of those impacts to the Dimona facility was close enough that Israeli emergency services and the Israel Atomic Energy Commission activated their response protocols. Close enough that the Israeli government acknowledged unusual activity in the area. Close enough that international monitoring organizations briefly elevated their alert status for potential radiological release. Was Dimona the intended target? This is the question that splits analysts, and the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, and that uncertainty itself is part of Iran's strategy. Iranian military doctrine, particularly in the context of its strikes against Israel, has evolved toward what strategists call strategic ambiguity in targeting, conducting attacks that are close enough to highly sensitive targets to demonstrate the capability to hit them while maintaining plausible deniability about whether the sensitive target was the actual aim point. It is a form of nuclear signaling without actually striking a nuclear facility. Iran is saying, without saying it directly, we can reach Dimona, we know where it is. Our missiles can get close. The next time, the calculation might be different. That message is received loud and clear in Tel Aviv, in Washington, and in every capital in the region that understands what a strike on Dimona would mean. But there is a more alarming possibility that deserves serious consideration. The possibility that some of the missiles that came near Dimona were not executing a deliberate near-miss strategy, but were actually aimed at the facility and were only stopped from hitting it by a combination of Israeli missile defense and mechanical failure in the Iranian missile systems. Iran has never publicly stated that Dimona is off-limits. Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and IRGC commanders have made statements over many years threatening to strike Israeli nuclear infrastructure if Iran itself is attacked. The Dimona facility has appeared in Iranian military publications and strategic documents as a category of target, and in the context of a large-scale Iranian ballistic missile barrage, which the April strike was, targeting the Negev broadly, with Dimona as one aim point among several, would be entirely consistent with Iranian declared doctrine. Let us think carefully about what a successful strike on Dimona would actually mean, because this is where the analysis needs to be most precise and most honest. The immediate effects would depend entirely on what was hit. If a ballistic missile struck the main reactor building, the result could range from a relatively contained structural collapse, the reactor is old and not operating at full power, to a more severe release of radioactive material depending on the state of the reactor and its containment at the time of impact. If a missile struck plutonium reprocessing or storage areas, the release of plutonium into the environment would be an extraordinarily serious long-term contamination event. Plutonium is not like the radioactive iodine released at Chernobyl, which is dangerous acutely but decays relatively quickly. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,000 years. A plutonium dispersal event over even a small area creates effectively permanent contamination of that land. The secondary effects of a Dimona strike would be just as significant as the physical ones. A strike on a nuclear facility, even one with conventional weapons, would almost certainly trigger an Israeli nuclear response doctrine review at the highest levels. Israel's nuclear posture is officially one of ambiguity, but it is widely understood that Israel has a last resort nuclear doctrine, a willingness to use nuclear weapons if the state itself faces existential threat. A successful Iranian strike on Dimona, the physical heart of Israel's nuclear deterrent, could plausibly be interpreted under Israeli doctrine as exactly that kind of existential challenge. The question of whether Israel would respond with conventional or nuclear force to a successful strike on Dimona is one that no Israeli official will ever answer publicly. But it is a question that Iranian military planners absolutely have to incorporate into their targeting calculus. Which raises the obvious question, if the risk of Israeli nuclear retaliation is real, why would Iran target Dimona at all? The answer loops back to the strategic ambiguity doctrine, demonstrating the capability without necessarily executing the strike, using proximity and plausible deniability to send the message without triggering the response. Now, here is where the story connects to everything else conflict capital has been covering in recent weeks, because the Dimona near-miss does not exist in isolation. It exists in a context that has been building for months. Iran's hypersonic missile development, which we covered in detail previously, has direct relevance here, because a hypersonic glide vehicle aimed at Dimona would present Israeli air defense with dramatically more difficult intercept geometry than a conventional ballistic missile. The layered Israeli defense system performed well against the April barrage, but its performance was aided by the relatively predictable trajectories of the missiles involved. As Iran's missile inventory shifts toward maneuvering in hypersonic systems, the probability of intercept against Dimona, which sits in the southern Negev, somewhat more distant from the densest concentration of Israeli air defense assets than Tel Aviv, decreases. The geography matters. Air defense coverage is not uniform across Israeli territory, and the Negev presents a more challenging defensive environment than central Israel. The USS carrier deployments we discussed in our previous video also connect here, because American carrier-based aircraft and American THAAD batteries in the region contributed to the intercept of the April barrage. Without American participation in Israeli air defense during these major Iranian attacks, the intercept rates would almost certainly be lower. That American participation is not guaranteed in every future scenario. It depends on the political decisions of an American president at a specific moment of crisis, on the rules of engagement in force at that time, and on whether American assets are themselves under simultaneous attack from Iranian proxies in Iraq, Syria, or Yemen. Iran has demonstrated in multiple operations that it can coordinate attacks across multiple theaters simultaneously, a scenario in which Hezbollah is firing rockets at northern Israel, Houthi drones are attacking American ships in the Red Sea, and Iranian ballistic missiles are heading toward the Negev, all at the same time, is exactly the kind of scenario that strains every defensive system simultaneously and potentially degrades the coordinated response that stopped the April barrage from being catastrophic. There's a nuclear proliferation dimension to the Dimona story that almost nobody in mainstream coverage is discussing, and it is arguably the most important long-term implication of what just happened. Every time Iran demonstrates that it can put missiles in the vicinity of Dimona, it makes a specific argument to a specific audience, the governments of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and the UAE. That argument goes like this: Israel's nuclear monopoly in the Middle East is not permanent. The facility that produces and stores those weapons is reachable. If Iran can reach it with conventional missiles today, Iran, or eventually a nuclear-armed Iran, could threaten it existentially tomorrow. Therefore, any regional power that relies on Israel's nuclear deterrent as a backstop against Iranian aggression needs to reconsider that reliance. And the logical conclusion of that reconsideration, for a country like Saudi Arabia, which has explicitly stated it would pursue nuclear weapons if Iran acquired them, is to accelerate its own path to nuclear capability. This is the proliferation cascade that nuclear security experts have warned about for years, and the Dimona near-miss accelerates the logic of it. Saudi Arabia has a civilian nuclear program under development. It has significant financial resources. It has a pre-existing relationship with Pakistan, a nuclear state, that has fueled speculation for decades about a potential Saudi option to acquire Pakistani nuclear weapons or technology in a crisis scenario. Turkey, a NATO member, but an increasingly independent strategic actor under President Erdogan, has made statements about nuclear sovereignty that alarmed Western allies. Egypt has the technical infrastructure to restart a nuclear program if it chose to. The dominoes of Middle East nuclear proliferation have been standing for years, carefully balanced by the combination of American security guarantees, Israeli deterrence, and the apparent stability of the regional order. The Dimona near-miss is a very visible reminder of how fragile that balance is. At this point, we need to have an honest conversation about what international law and international norms say about strikes on nuclear facilities, because the legal and normative dimension of this story has significant implications for how the world responds to it. Attacks on nuclear facilities are treated with extraordinary seriousness under international humanitarian law, specifically because of the potential for catastrophic civilian harm from radiological release. The International Atomic Energy Agency has standing protocols for exactly this scenario. Multiple UN Security Council resolutions have addressed the protection of nuclear facilities in conflict zones, and the specific prohibition on attacks that would cause disproportionate civilian harm, which a strike causing nuclear contamination of populated areas clearly would, is one of the most firmly established principles of the laws of armed conflict. The problem is that none of these legal frameworks have effective enforcement mechanisms when the parties involved are already in active military conflict outside the established international order. Iran and Israel are not at peace. They are engaged in what has become an openly acknowledged military conflict, and both sides have demonstrated a willingness to conduct operations that push against or cross lines that would previously have been considered absolute. The legal prohibition on striking nuclear facilities is real and serious, but in the context of an ongoing exchange of ballistic missile strikes, drone attacks, and covert operations, the question of whether Iran would be deterred from striking Dimona by international law is, honestly, not a question anyone should feel confident answering yes to. What is the path forward from here? What does the Dimona near-miss tell us about where this conflict is heading and what the realistic options are for preventing it from reaching a catastrophic endpoint? There are no easy answers, but there are honest ones. The first honest answer is that the current trajectory, a cycle of Iranian attacks, Israeli responses, Iranian counter-responses, with each cycle escalating slightly further than the last, has no natural stopping point that does not involve either a decisive military outcome or a negotiated framework that neither side currently seems willing to accept. The second honest answer is that the nuclear dimension of this conflict, both the threat to Dimona and the potential Iranian path to nuclear weapons, makes the cost of allowing this escalation cycle to continue without resolution astronomically high. Every round of escalation is another roll of the dice against catastrophic outcomes. The third honest answer is that the United States remains the only actor with enough leverage over both parties to create the conditions for a negotiated framework. But American political attention, American diplomatic capital, and American willingness to absorb the domestic political cost of Middle East engagement are all finite and currently stretched across multiple crises simultaneously. Here at Conflict Capital, we follow these stories not because they are exciting, though they are, but because they matter in ways that affect real lives, real communities, and the real future of a region where tens of millions of people are simply trying to live. The people of Dimona, Israeli citizens who woke up to air raid sirens and missile intercepts visible in the sky above their city, did not choose to live next to a nuclear weapons program. The people of Iran, who have no voice in the military decisions of their government, did not choose to be placed on a collision course with one of the most consequential conflicts in modern history. And the people across the region, in Jordan, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Saudi Arabia, who would bear the consequences of a radiological event at Dimona through no fault of their own, deserve to have the people with power understand exactly what is at stake. The missiles that fell near Dimona were not just weapons. They were a message, a test, a warning, and potentially a near miss of historic proportions, all at the same time. Understanding that fully, without minimizing it and without catastrophizing it beyond what the evidence supports, is exactly what responsible analysis of this moment requires. The world came closer to a nuclear-adjacent catastrophe than most people realize. The mechanisms that prevented that catastrophe this time, missile defense, fortunate trajectories, operational limitations, and Iranian missile accuracy, are not guaranteed to hold indefinitely. That is the most important sentence in this entire video. And it is the sentence that should shape how policymakers, analysts, and ordinary citizens think about what needs to happen next.